Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Joe Guinan. I'm president of the Democracy Collaborative, TDC. I'm joined by Kalia Kuno and Edgar Petru from the People's Network for Land and Liberation. Welcome and thanks for joining us for today's webinar discussion on Trump, I Do Mind Dying, Lessons for US Cities from the Military Occupation of the North of Ireland. We have an incredible discussion ahead, and we'll get right to it in a moment. But first, we wanted to give you a few words of background about the organizations involved and what we're seeking to do together with this conversation. At TDC, we're a US-based nonprofit organization dedicated to community wealth building and political economic system change to build a democratic economy. Our mission is to create a world of peace, justice, equality, empowerment, and community ownership and control. And we try to do this, God help us, through progressive economics. It's a difficult moment, as I know everyone understands, what with climate change, the backlash against economic inequality, the rise of the far right. And here in the United States, where we're joining you from, it's a very dangerous, febrile situation. More on that in a moment. We're seeing a fusion of corporate and state power that's reminiscent, at the very least, of fascism. And we're witnessing almost on a daily basis now provocations aimed at accelerating political violence and consequent crackdowns and the erosions of our rights and freedoms. And so that age-old question of whether it's possible for a society half plutocratic and half democratic to endure for very long is now being tested to destruction. And I'll spare you all the suspense. It's not. One of those things must eventually subsume the other. And we see this happening today right before our very eyes, as the plutocratic economy of fascist billionaires consumes our democracies. In our view, the goal now must be to reverse this. We must suffuse democracy into our economy and build the new political economic system now necessary for our survival. And it's from that standpoint that the host organizations come to you today. At TDC, we're proud to be co-hosting this webinar with three other organizations, close partners of ours. The People's Network for Land and Liberation is a multiracial, multi-ethnic consortium of 6 community-based organizations located across the United States, seeking to build local solidarity economies as autonomous liberated zones, a bit like the sign where you're now entering free Derry. And at the heart of PNLL is the model first rolled out by Kali and his comrades in Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, which is to advance democratic ownership of the means of production and co-create liberatory social relationships and communities that regenerate the Earth's life-giving ecosystems, all in right relationship to the land. So that's us on the US side. On the Irish side, you know, sometimes history gives you the friends and the comrades that you need just when you need them the most. And TDC and PNLL have been deeply engaged for a couple of years now in transatlantic dialogue with our other 2 co-sponsoring organizations today in the north of Ireland, Trademark Belfast and Glór Mona. Trademark Belfast is an independent social justice organization based in the heart of West Belfast and rooted in the Irish trade union movement. Trademark's aim is to support workers, communities, and progressive movements to navigate a changing world and build the foundations for a democratic and sustainable future. At TDC, we've been working with Trademark to advance the conversation on community wealth building in Ireland, and we were contributors together to the independent panel advisory reports on community wealth building to the Northern Irish Executive in October 2022. And then last, but very, very much not least, we have Glór Mona. Glór Mona is a grassroots Irish language, community and youth organization committed to social change from the bottom up. It's been awe-inspiring for us all to see the work that Glór Mona has been doing with community organizing, power building, culture and political education in West Belfast. Fergal and Kieran at Glór Mona have done the lion's share of the work in putting together today's event, and we thank them and all their comrades for that. Our 4-way collaboration has really been about peace building, international solidarity, anti-imperialism and social justice, and about human emancipation and liberation through democracy and community economic transformation, all in search of deep system change. And it's clear that the current system is not merely failing, but is no longer prepared or even able to let us all live and let live in this era of militarization, war, and the management through violence of what are beginning to be termed and categorized surplus populations, which if you really look into it, eventually means the vast majority of us. So we're coming together today in a spirit of urgency and to establish ties of international solidarity in a moment of great political peril. With National Guard troops moving into Black-led cities in the United States, this webinar will be the first in a series of dialogues with activists from around the world that have confronted hostile military occupations of their own cities and communities by military dictatorships or settler-colonial regimes. And it's fitting that this series should start as a conversation between activists in Black America and the North of Ireland. Against all odds, we have at various points in our histories been able to establish deep solidarities and mutual recognition of shared struggle. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement in America was the direct inspiration for the civil rights movement in the North of Ireland. Then Bernadette Devlin McCalskey replayed the compliment when she was given the key to the city of New York and then turned and gave it to the Black Panthers. So the black and the green, the one struggle. Add in a few reds, and I'm sure there are plenty of them here today, and a few whites, and you even get the colors of the Palestinian flag. That's another cause that we have in common. And so thank you for joining this conversation about international solidarity and shared struggle. For myself, my own part, one thing I am very certain of, we are going to need each other more than ever before in the coming weeks and months and years of our struggle to build a better world beyond fascism and war. Welcome, and let me turn now to Kelly Akuno and Edget Batru of PNLL to introduce themselves and set the table for this conversation.
All right, well, thank you, Joe. That was an excellent breakdown. Good modeling. So I'll start. My name is Kali Akuno. Many of you on these airways probably know me from other initiatives trying to educate, the broad public about issues of economic democracy, social justice, climate justice. But today we're really going to focus in on dealing with the growing threat that our cities are facing on account of Trump and the MAGA movement. So I'll start and then kick it over to Edget with just a bit of framing, just on our part, and to just keep it short. There's so much to say, and there's every day, kind of, I think we all are waking up to new threats, just new deranged attempts by this administration to curtail one for today in this conversation with our Irish comrades. One of the things to really, I think, understand and grapple with is that right now in the United States, in effect, we have one party rule. The Republicans control the executive branch, they control the legislative branch, and they control the judicial branch. And Trump in particular is publicly and very openly trying to ensure that there's one party rule indefinitely. And so the Trump regime is planning on controlling the outcome in particular of the 2026 elections and beyond. And this is not something that we are making up. This is something that comes directly out of his own mouth. He said on several occasions that the 2024 election was the last one that his supporters would have to do and that he would take care of the rest. That's not something that he said lightly. And if we look at the motions, the things he's put in motions basically since coming into office of trying to do all of this redistricting well before the 10-year clock of when they normally do that, and all the voter restrictions, we need to take them very seriously. But that's just one method by which they're going to do that. The primary way that this regime is going about accomplishing this goal is by criminalizing and repressing the core constituency of the Democratic Party, that is the Black working class, particularly Black working class members in urban centers throughout the United States. To this end, the Trump regime has ordered the military invasion of several urban cities that have Black working class majorities and or Black political leadership, including Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Memphis. These invasions deploy elements of the armed forces, in particular the Marines and the National Guard, but also Homeland Security, the FBI, ICE, and several other quote-unquote federal law enforcement agencies. And to justify these invasions, the MAGA movement, with all their various arms, paints these as crime-ridden, lawless kind of havens that are grossly mismanaged by incompetent Black leaders and their white enablers in the Democratic Party. So this serves a particular aim and objective is what we need to be clear about. And that's why he's continuing to threaten New Orleans, Jackson, Mississippi, now in several other cities, Baltimore, Oakland, New York City even, with these types of occupations. And so we are trying to get you and the broad audience and the broad public in the United States ready for how to deal with these invasions. And with that, I turn it over to Edgar.
Thank you, Kali. It's really good to be here with you all this morning. I feel like there's so much we could learn from your experience, particularly in this time. So there's a few questions that we have in mind, and we were hoping that you could speak to those, beginning with the issue that Kali just mentioned, that being the police repression which is not new in Black and Brown communities in the US, but there's clearly been a profound escalation. And as we navigate this new era, what lessons can we learn from your experiences confronting the military occupation of your communities in the north of Ireland by the British Army during the so-called Troubles? So that's one question. The other one we're hoping you could speak to is during the Troubles, groups like the Irish Republican Socialist Party and Sinn Féin wrestled with how to defend their communities while also building broad political movements. And it seems like when folks employed violence defensively, it tended to gain legitimacy in the community. However, when disconnected violence occurred, it often further isolated groups. So given your experience, how do you think we can prioritize community self-defense and mass participation to effectively resist and defeat the invasions that the Trump regime is advancing currently in our communities? Another question we would like for you to speak on is the reasons why Trump, is advancing currently these occupations. It's really an effort to institutionalize an already existing fear of the state in our communities and to try to normalize this dominance of the military apparatus in our daily lives. So could you please speak to how you fought this social normalization of the British occupation over the 30 years of the Troubles, and if there are ways that we can mitigate this normalization of that presence in our communities? I know this is a lot. And one more question is, during the Troubles, both the British state and the elites tended to paint Irish radicals as criminals and terrorists when in fact you are defending your own communities. So how can we as activists, particularly those in the Black and Brown communities, counter the state and corporate media framing us as terrorists, violence, and seeking to delegitimize our resistance and to justify the repression that we're experiencing? So not all of you need to speak on all of those things, but we're hoping to hear from you on these topics.
Thanks, Edgar. And just a few questions there for our Irish comrades to chew on. Let me turn now then to Fergal McCunrachty from Glornamoda, who will introduce the incredible lineup that we have on the Irish side now of veterans of the struggle in the north of Ireland. Fergal.
Of our four speakers, that we have lined up here, and then we can hear from each of them, one after the other. They're going to speak for about 5 minutes or so, and hopefully address some of the questions that Edgar has raised there. So firstly, I'll begin with Fergus O'Hare. Fergus O'Hare, he'll be glad that I announce him as the oldest of our cohort, although he doesn't look it. Fergus is a socialist grassroots activist going back over 60 years, who played a leading role in the civil rights campaign in the late 60s and early 1970s. He was a leading figure in the anti-H block prison struggle, and later on he would establish Manskull Firstja and Radio Falsha, two very well-known Irish language projects in the city. He was also an elected councillor in 1981 as a founding member of the People's Democracy movement. After that, we will go to Anne-Marie Quinn from Belfast. Anne-Marie is from the Ballymurphy area of West Belfast, and she became active in the Republican resistance movement after British military occupation. She was imprisoned in Armagh Women's Prison between 1976 and 1985 after being caught with guns and explosives. Upon her release, she spent 25 years working in mental health and is still active in Republican politics. Then we will hear from Tommy McKerney from County Tyrone. He was born originally in Lurgan and raised in the Moy in the southeast of County Tyrone. He was born into a family with a long tradition of Irish republicanism and became a leading figure in the Irish Republican Army in the Tyrone area. Tommy served a life sentence in Longcash prison for his involvement in the IRA campaign. He would also take part in the 1980 hunger strike, where he would be 53 days on hunger strike. 3 of Tommy's brothers were assassinated by pro-British forces in Ireland. Upon his release, Tommy played a leading role in setting up the Independent Workers' Union and the Pater O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. And lastly, we will have Shana Walsh. Shana is from Belfast and spent 21 years in prison over 3 periods. And he is renowned for being caught red-handed on all of those 3 occasions for his military activities. He was caged in Longcash in the cages between 1973 and 1976. He learned Irish while he was incarcerated and became a central figure in the promotion and spread of the Irish language during the H block struggle, where he was incarcerated between 1976 and 1984. He was also the best friend of IRA hunger striker and elected MP Bobby Sands. He would then find himself incarcerated again between 1988 and 1998. He has remained a Republican activist upon his release and is currently the manager of the RSE Canada Interpretive Centre in West Belfast. So that's our 4 speakers, Akarja, and I think we will start off by handing over to Fergus.
Okay, I'm traveling McClinton.
Yep.
Okay, sorry that I missed the introduction there because there were some technical problems at this side. My name's Fergus O'Hare. I'm from Belfast, and most of my political activity has been based here. I got involved with the civil rights movement, which started here in the late 60s and was modeled very much on the civil rights movement in the United States. That civil rights movement was designed to try to change the inequalities which were being suffered for many years since the setting up of the state by the nationalist or Catholic community. These labels don't really correctly describe the situation. Basically, it was those people who wanted to be in a united Ireland, or who saw themselves as Irish rather than British. That community suffered serious discrimination in terms of jobs and housing and so on since the start of the state. And the civil rights movement in the 60s was designed to try to remove those injustices. The civil rights movement, which was a peaceful organization, set out on a series of demonstrations and was very quickly met by the full might of the northern state here, the Northern Ireland state, and then by the might of the British state when the British Army was sent in to basically stop the unrest which arose up around the civil rights movement. The British Army were sent in, and the police and the British Army inflicted massive repression on the nationalist communities here. And as a result of that, resistance sprang up to the actual physical and military presences here, and that's where the situation with the IRA began its struggle against the oppression that was been suffered here. So it's important to counter the narrative which the British put out about violence springing up here by the IRA. The violence which came here was a result of British violence, which was inflicted on the people in the first case. My involvement through that, once the civil rights movement period came into the more militarized and period, my involvement was largely in with the People's Democracy Group, which was mentioned there, was to involve the masses in the struggle. Military struggle, by its nature, almost tends to become somewhat corralled, where because of needs for secrecy and of weapons and stuff like that, it doesn't lend itself entirely to mass participation as well as mass activities would. So our role was very much to try and involve the masses of the population in the struggle. And it became a very high level of mass participation, where we had in the Belfast area, where I was in West Belfast, we had the situation where areas were barricaded off, that the communities had come out and built barricades to keep the forces of the state out. And within those, what were called no-go areas, a large amount of community organization was involved, where people were involved in setting up, and this is the sort of work that we were involved in promoting, setting up local resistance committees and bringing those committees to where we had elections. I remember one election where we had polling booths in people's garages, people's kitchens, people's living rooms, people's gardens, where people came in and voted for whoever they thought in their local community could represent them. And that then set up a local committee. And we were moving towards what was called the Parliament of the Streets, to try to actually get people to involve themselves insofar as we could outside of the systems of the state, because we were keeping the forces of the state and the systems of the state out as much as possible. There were rent strikes because most of the houses in those areas were state-owned houses. So people refused to pay their rents and their rates. There were mass demonstrations, there were riots, and there were, again, a lot of community organization because the state was being kept out. People organized themselves through community activities, through the setting up of cooperatives, through the setting up of cooperative shops, cooperative garages, and all of that sort of activity to try and keep the community actually existing in the normal ways of being able to buy food and so on, keeping the community clean, organizing activities for young people, and so on. So that was very much the level of activity which was going on in those early years, and that would have been from the civil rights movement started in 1968. By 1969, it had exploded into this sort of mass opting out, where practically the whole of the nationalist community in Belfast and in other areas had opted out of the state and were under massive attack by the state, and were organizing themselves within those communities as best they could behind the barricades in the no-go areas. There were a lot of things which were important, and that was, again, the involvement of the community at whichever level they could be involved. I remember even in riots, which are usually the area for young and healthy people, that we would organize that people who weren't up in the front line would be behind, gathering ammunition, but gathering stones and bottles and whatever it was. So that in the involvement of everyone in the activity, that this was a people's struggle, was very important. As part of that, we were running a radio station, an illegal radio station, and we were organizing, keeping people informed in what was going on. Now, in the days before the internet and so on, it was done by local newspapers, political newspapers, by political organizations, and by leaflets going from door to door, and meetings held at street corner, going from street corner to street corner to street corner with a megaphone, bringing people out. Now, I think today, That has largely been lost, where people tend to use the internet and social media for organizing. I think there's a strong argument for actually getting back to that level of going door to door, insofar as it's possible, in whatever situation you're in, because it gives that physical, personal contact with people, where you're going door to door, you're talking to people, and you're getting them involved in the organization. I think another very important thing, and this may sound flippant or not, but is festivals and songs, that people write songs, learn songs, and sing the songs together. If you remember the civil rights movement in the States, with this songs like "We Shall Overcome," which was used here as well, I think it's important that aspect of it, because it brings people together, that those activities are organized insofar as they can be within the areas, concerts, festivals, or whatever it is, to bring the community together, and with a strong political message of organizing on a mass basis. So that was largely that went on now during the whole period of that massive uprising after the civil rights movement. Lots of people were being killed. There were lots of people killed. There were hundreds of young people in jail, either through trial or with no trial. They were thrown into jails, and there were mass demonstrations around getting those people out and so on. So I think the lessons that I would bring, insofar as they're applicable, is in mass involvement, contact with the people, explaining to people what's going on, trying to get through from the nonsense and the publicity that they're reading from the mass media or from social media, to actually contact people and explain to them what the reality is, what's going on, give them hope, give them ideas of what can be done. Also, the idea of self-organization. I mean, I remember being on central committees of different organizations and coming back from meetings and discovering that the people in the communities were organizing things which we hadn't even thought of. So it's these great central committees and the organizing bodies, how they thought that people were coming up with their own ways of agitating and organizing. So involvement of people and in the movement of keeping people informed and of keeping people together through activities, maybe sports activities, maybe songs, music activities, or whatever, but that is to build the mass movement and keep the mass movement informed. I think would be the message that I would try to bring out from what the experiences we had. And obviously every situation is different, and people have to try to apply the different lessons in their own circumstance. But I think that if there's an overriding approach, that would be the approach that I would take. It's involve the masses. We are the many, they are the few, and keep the many as involved as they can.
Fergus, thank you very much. That was very helpful, very comprehensive. We're going to now go over to Anne-Marie Quinn, if she can take it up from here. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, I just realised I had my mute on there. I've just taken my mute off, so I have. Hello, I'm Anne-Marie Quinn. I'm from West Belfast area of Ireland, and from an area known as Ballymurphy. Ballymurphy was very entrenched in the Troubles and very active and very military during the Troubles on the side of the IRA. I'll go back to when it would have started for me. It would have been 1969, when my father and other men were jumping in lorries going over to Bombay Street and to North Belfast to help people out of their homes, to move from their homes who were being burnt out. So the Protestant community became afraid of the civil rights movement, who were wanting better conditions for Catholics, better living conditions, better education conditions, better health conditions. Catholics were really neglected and really treated badly since 1921, since the Ireland was sliced and a border was put up. So really the Catholics were treated so badly over years. Were some living in like tin huts and stuff. People going for jobs were being asked what school they went to, and when they said the name of the Catholic school, they weren't getting jobs. So it was very difficult for people in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, growing up in the north of Ireland. So come 60s, the likes of Fergus O'Hare and People's Democracy and the civil rights community began agitating and asking for rights. They were entitled to their rights, and they asked for them, they protested for them, they marched for them, and were beaten off the streets. I would remember that now when I was 10-year-old, and the British Army were sent in 1969 to our areas, and they were sent in and they again joined forces with the loyalist Protestant community and to beat Catholics down and to stop us getting any rights at all. The Catholic communities, of course, we grew up with stories of how it was for our parents and about the Black and Tans, about the Easter Rising. We grew up with all these stories from our parents. So it's about knowledge, it's about awareness. I think we were all very self-aware. And I would find even in today's society, people who have a strong identity, seem to do better in life. They seem to go forward more positively than people who are brought up in denial of anything happening, anything going wrong, of society being wrong. If people aren't brought up with a societal interest or an awareness, they do fall back, they do fall behind, and they get very mixed ideas. So I would advise very strongly to keep, even with children, make them aware, make them very aware of, to be proud of who they are and what they stand for. Well, as the Troubles progressed, especially in the Ballymurphy area, the activism from the IRA, professional IRA, became totally tense. It became so tense. Every day they were active on the streets, every single day. It was a guerrilla warfare, and people were very aware of their security, of their identities, of trying to mix the British Army up when they were stopped in the streets, of not giving their names, of trying their best not to give any information to make it easy for the British government. It was very much a case of beating people down. There was internment, where it was all Catholics were interned. There was 3 loyalists, 3 Protestants interned, as compared to hundreds of Catholics. Of course, a lot of them were innocent, just very much like today, where there was 210 arrested on immigration issues in the USA. 53 of them, 210,000, 52,000 were detained. So in the same way, a lot of people who have their authorization papers are going to be tortured as well. So they needn't think they're going to be free from this. A lot of people think, I'll stay on the sidelines, I'll mind my own business, I'll have nothing to do with this. And unfortunately, they very much are the same colour and the same background, and therefore they will. And as I said, if there was 210,000 arrested so far on immigration issues and 52,000 detained in America, then it proves the point that a lot of people are going to be tortured and beaten, just as we would have been beaten on the streets. So I had decided at a young age to become a Republican or a Republican activist. I was arrested in September 1976 with my comrade Paul Brennan, and we went on from there to be on remand and then to be sentenced, him to 16 years and I was sentenced to 12 years. At that time, you're supposed to do half of your sentence, and I was supposed to do 6 years, but unfortunately I did almost 9 years because of the prison protests that were happening. So I believe this will be happening at the same time with yourselves, because while you're in prison, you're very much treated as a Republican activist while they're trying to criminalise you. They told us we were criminals. They tried to beat criminalisation into us. They tried to make us go to work as criminals, and we refused in prison. They tried to make us do different things to criminalise us, and on every count we refused to do that. As a result, we were locked up in the beginning 21 hours a day, and were losing remission, losing parcels, losing visits. That increased to pressure from the screws, prison warders. That increased so much by 1979 that we did know that it was coming to a more serious point. By February 1980, they sent in male warders to beat us up at the lunch table. We were all around gathering, getting lunch, and I think there was 32 women at the time, and they came in with full-length shields and they beat us. So some got beaten badly. Yeah, I got through over a man's shoulder and was knocked out for a short time. A lot of the girls had bruises and everything. They came back up into the cells later on that evening. They made us go up to the cells one at a time. They then come back to the cells that evening and beat us up in the cells. There were 2 men jumped on me at the time, and this was jail life. So this is what you can expect. Jail life is a continuation of what you see on the streets. What you would call ICE is then enforced by the army, by the Marines, as you say, by the powers that be. And that's very much carried out within the prisons as well. So we very much felt in prison that we were still fighting on behalf of the IRA during the whole time in prison. The scooper, the warders at every opportunity, they were given their orders by the prison governor. He was given his orders by the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland, who was given his orders by Parliament in London and the Prime Minister. So very much what Trump says will stifle down to those on the streets and those in the prisons. And that is where you really have to be strong. As a result, 3 women joined hunger strike in 1980. We went on a no wash protest. We were on the no wash protest for 13 months because they refused to let us out to have any sanitary conditions. They had used toilets to get washed, and as a result, we refused them to use any sanitary ware that they provided. It was very hard times. I'll not pretend it wasn't hard. It was very hard times. It was the hardest time of all was watching 3 women, Mairead Farrell, Mary Doyle and Mairead Nugent, on hunger strike. They were on the first hunger strike in 1980 for 19 days. As everyone knows, the Brits reneged on what they offered, and that resulted in the second hunger strike in 1981, where the 10 men died. That was a very heartbreaking time for everyone in the north of Ireland, and more so probably for all the prisoners who felt comradeship with them and very much togetherness with them. So never underestimate solidarity and comradeship. Never ever underestimate that. You know, people are there for you. People will be there supporting you. People are listening every single day on the news and deciphering what's true and what's not true. And we're too long in the tooth by now, and it's easy for us. It's easy for us really to say, well, we hear something, we know it's not true. Trump, how anybody could even vote Trump, and it's unbelievable, because that man, I think he's mad. I think he's quite mad, you know. He's a criminal. First of all, the fact that he's a criminal, he should never have been allowed in the position that he's in. So sympathise, very much sympathise with what the American people are going through at the minute. All of those who are immigrants.
Yep.
An awful lot of sympathy going towards you all. And especially the black, brown community, because you're being pointed out. We could have got away with things. So record. My advice would be record everything. That's where we fell short in the beginning, I believe. Record everything, witness everything, write down who does what, who did what to who, and witnesses who were present at the time. That's really all I could say at the minute, unless I'm asked direct questions.
That's fantastic, Anne-Marie. That's really great. We'll also perhaps get a chance to come back on some of that, on obviously on the contributions that everybody has made at Thursday. Hopefully, we'll be able to have a conversation, and we can follow that on. So, Gurmí Moiget, Shin, Anne-Marie, we're going to be going to Tommy McKerney now, who will be taking us out of Belfast to the Mid-Ulster area and sharing some of his experiences. Hoggan Senesh at Tommy.
Margaret Fergus. I came from Mid-Ulster, rural part of the north of Ireland, and I think the first thing we have to keep in mind is that the situation that we inherited was a result of colonialisation by the British. In the 17th century, the British decided that they needed to replace the indigenous population with what they called a plantation of Ulster, plantation that taken people in from Britain, Scotland, England, and Wales to displace the indigenous population, which actually was relatively successful from a British point of view insofar as that it effectively planted a living garrison on the island of Ireland, quite similar to what's happening in the Middle East, happened in the Middle East with the Zionist plantation in 1948. But as time went by, the colonial settler situation developed to an extent that while the people who had planted or came from abroad settled down, become embedded, it was still very possible, particularly in parts of where I came from, to see the effects of that settlement, where the pro-British settlers or planters all invariably had the best land, had the best parts of the country, the most fertile land. The indigenous Irish had been drove to the mountains and into the wastelands. And then to keep in mind, this is something they have to keep in mind, that in order to maintain control, Britain viewed the north of Ireland as a key aspect of maintaining control. They had to maintain a division between basically those that had arrived and the indigenous people, because as time was going by, there was always the danger, as far as the British were concerned, that the two sides would come together, as they did in the late 1790s, to form what we call the United Irishmen, the Republicans. Now, Republican have to be very careful about Irish republicanism. It's qualitatively different from US republicanism. But Britain had to ensure that the two sides wouldn't come together, so they maintained a sectarian division. Now, this pertained right through to the 1960s, based on with systemic discrimination between, let me use the term Catholic and Protestant. Now, they're not theological terms, they're more cultural terms. Catholic meaning the indigenous Irish, and Protestant meaning pro-union with Britain. But I'm not using the terms theologically at all. As I was growing up, there was always a very strong police presence, backed up by a piece of draconian legislation known as the Special Powers Act, which, believe it or not, the South African apartheid regime was envious of, because they thought that it was even more powerful than anything they had in terms of their legislation in South Africa during the apartheid years. And it gave the authorities in the north of Ireland enormous policing powers. And the police used their authority ruthlessly, and they were supported by a reserve police force known as the B Specials. The B Specials were exclusively from one side of the community, heavily armed, and as time went by and civil rights movement rose to challenge the hegemony of the unionist regime in the 6 counties of the north of Ireland, which was pro-British, maintained the British connection. and were instrumental, were crucial for Britain to hold their control over what they used as a strategically important part of their defence system. So they were prepared, the British state, in spite of the spin they put on it, the British had a vested interest in maintaining control over hegemony, effective control in the north of Ireland. So as the civil rights movement started to challenge the control, coercive legislation and a heavy hand was brought in to bear, and not only a heavy hand, but they began to use their brutal force, particularly in Belfast, which for the best part of a century or more had been effectively the Catholic population of Belfast were held as hostages to the good behaviour of the rest of their Catholic brethren in the rest of Ireland, particularly in the north of Ireland. But one of the things that strikes me very clearly is that not only did the British Army arrive the British Regular Army was always here, but with the outbreak of the civil rights movement and the response from the Unionist regime and bloody attack on the population that was promoting the civil rights movement, lethal attack, that the regular British Army was increased in the north of Ireland and expanded. But in order to maintain the divisions, it was a ruthless, cynical ploy. What was known as the B Specials were transformed into become a regiment of the British Army based locally in the north of Ireland, known as the Ulster Defence Regiment. Now, I'm reluctant to just draw parallels because I'm not that familiar with exactly the United States and its system, but it strikes me that the National Guard in the United States, because it's recruited locally and retained, as far as I know, it doesn't be transferred overseas to the same extent. It's a local regiment or a local division of the US military. And it sounds to me very like the Ulster Defence Regiment. The Ulster Defence Regiment was different to the extent that it was exclusively from one side of the community. And the danger, the real threat that it posed was that not only that it knew the land intimately, but it knew the population intimately. It could tell now, unlike the regular army, which was more English and Scottish, who were coming as strangers to our land, armed and dangerous admittedly, but still strangers without the intimate knowledge of inside information that a local group would have. The local group, the Ulster Defence Regiment, were particularly sectarian. They could tell at a glance now who was who. You could tell the different nuanced differences in the accents between one part of the country and the other. And very often they had connections with what was a counter-insurgency strategy deployed by the British. They used counter-gangs of Protestant paramilitaries who simply engaged in a purely sectarian struggle against their neighbours, killing Catholic people simply in order to intimidate. This was a policy the British had used for well over a century. And after the Second World War in particular, it had been refined. It had been practiced in Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus, Yemen, across the board. The British had a policy of terrorising the civilian population to prevent them from supporting any opposition. And at the moment, there's a case going on in Afghanistan where British military killed, shot out of hand, murdered actually, civilian people in Afghanistan in order to intimidate the population. It's a very calculated, cynical ploy, bloodthirsty and ruthless. That's what we were aware of happening. But my personal story was then that I had joined the IRA in the early 70s, was captured in 1977 and taken first to a holding centre called Castlereagh, where I was simply tortured, to be honest, for 7 days. Taken before one judge, no jury trial, convicted on the basis of an alleged verbal statement which had been concocted by the police, and sentenced to life imprisonment. And thereafter, I went on what we call the blanket protest because the British had decided that they were going to change the narrative away from too many people in the world knew what the British Empire stood for, knew them as an repressive, bloodthirsty regime. So they decided that rather than contest the ground with us, that they would deem us criminal terrorists, as Anne-Marie has said. Now, in order to do that, they wanted to show us pictures, photographs, clips of us captured IRA to demonstrate that we were common criminals, that we would wear prison uniforms and do menial prison tasks, which we refused to do. We refused to wear the uniform. We refused to go to work. So we were stripped naked and confined to the cell 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where we had nothing to keep us from the cold except a scanty prison blanket, which protest lasted for a number of years until 1980. We decided to go on hunger strike. And as Anne-Marie pointed out, the British reneged on the terms of the first hunger strike, leading into the better known one, where 10 men died. And however, the fact is that with the 10 men dying, there was a new departure that came. It demonstrated that militant Irish republicanism had a very broad support base. Bobby Sands was elected as a member of Parliament, of the British Parliament, which shocked the British regime to its core at the time, forced them to reconsider their position. Now, while they didn't publicly admit it, I'm convinced that in private, that the deep state in Britain understood that they had to make an accommodation with the Republican movement, which led eventually to what became known as the Good Friday Agreement. Now, while I'm not convinced or not really enamored with it, all its details, it certainly indicated that the British had to meet Irish Republican demands to a certain extent. But without getting into Ireland's finer points, the fact remained that Britain continued to use its military against the Republican Army right to the last. But not only that, but also operated a covert anti or counterinsurgency strategy, where it deployed its loyalist death squads to carry out sectarian assassinations of people from the Catholic population in order to intimidate right to the very end. So I'm reluctant to start giving advice. You ask me questions if you like, but I don't want to start giving advice to our comrades in the United States. I have great sympathy and empathy with their struggle. I can understand what's happening. But advice, you can ask me questions if you like, but I'm not going to start giving advice without knowing any somewhat more. So I think I'll maybe stop at that. Okay.
That's a rose, Tommy. Thanks very much. That's fantastic. Appreciate to come shake our flag, and we're going to finish. We're going to head over to Shana Brannock, Shana Walsh, and I left out Shana's bio that he's also an elected councillor. He was having his internet, so I think he's sort of. So over to yourself, Shana.
I'm not a guard. Jigla Mayor Clinton, okay? And Jig? Yeah, okay. Well, I suppose the for me, the sort of starting point, because so much of our history has been covered and covered comprehensively by the previous speakers. But for me, as a young person, in Belfast. And
Sorry, Shana, could you speak up a wee bit?
Right. I don't know how to turn this up, to be honest with you. Let us see. No, I can't turn it up.
That's
Oh,
better
sorry.
now. That's better now, the way you're talking there.
That's better now, mate. That's you. Go ahead.
Well, as I was saying, the thing for me was that the whole business of the conflict here was really, it was rooted in our history, obviously, and the history of resistance that was like a folk memory that fed down through our communities for generations. However, until the 1969, with the burning of streets in Belfast by the forces of the state, along with their loyalist allies, and then the resistance that emerged from that. For me, that was my real starting point. There was no history of republicanism in my family. There was no that I knew of. We heard stories at our granny's knee of how our communities were defended in previous years, but there was no sense of an organization, armed resistance in our areas. And so from the very early days, once the loyalist attacks started, once the confrontation started with the British Army, it was then that I really sort of became educated. And you know, the internment and what followed was very, very clearly, you know, it was very clearly what was wrong with the state here, because we had the previous attempts by loyalists to create an emergency by attacking the infrastructure, the electricity pylons, and the water provision to Belfast. And they disguised it as attacks by a nascent, a non-existent IRA. And what you had then was the forces of the state accepted what was going on, but portrayed it. They knew who was involved in it, but they portrayed it as some sort of an assault by the Republican community, by the IRA, in fact, as a pretext for clamping down on the nationalist areas. So there was always this culture of resistance, as far as I was concerned. When the British Army really entered our streets after internment and after what they called Operation Motorman, where they really occupied our areas, they took over houses, they took over blocks of flats, they took over schools, they took over hospitals, they took over sports grounds, and they turned them into fortresses in the very heart of the nationalist areas of Belfast and other towns and cities across the north. It was a fully fledged military occupation, you know, and we used to joke about it, that it was like whenever the US cavalry used to go in and occupy the Indian territory, because they controlled our movement. Anytime that you left the house, you were subject, or you were liable to be searched. You were spread eagled up against the wall and questioned as to where you were coming from, where you were going to. There was brutalization involved. There were also targeted killings and random killings.
As a reminder, 2 steps.
Right, okay. So you had all of this, and it in itself led to a whole generation of young Republicans becoming active and resisting the British occupation in this part of Ireland. You know, the thing for us in those early days, it was as black and white as we are trying to drive the British Army into the sea. And whenever I ended up in jail in the early 1970s and watched in 1975, we watched on our television screens Vietnam and the resistance of the Vietnamese people. We watched the American troops being driven out of Vietnam. At that stage, I was preparing for release from Long Kesh, and I was saying, well, let's go, folks, because I'm looking forward to getting out and doing the same thing with the British Army. However, you know, I was very young, and the idea of that was totally unrealistic. And I say that in the sense that the IRA in the 1970s, the IRA in the 1980s, the IRA even in the 1990s, the objective was not to drive the British Army back into the sea. The objective was to resist whatever attempts that the British were trying to implement to normalize politics here in the North, to normalize life here in the North, to defeat the Republican resistance. And therefore, the strategy for us was simply to continue to resist. That was our objective, to continue to resist whatever attempts at a quasi-political solution they attempted to put in place. It was our job to resist that. It was our job to knock that down and allow them to come back with a different one, and then we would knock that down until they arrived at the position where they accepted that they could not rule this place like a military occupation. Now, that is me sort of condensing and really sort of pushing things, really squeezing things into very few short sentences. But it's as simple as that for the from an IRA perspective. However, the other elements to it were that we always understood that a small organization like the IRA had to be simply like the tip of the spear, that you had to have everything flowing back from that. You had to have the cultural resistance of your community. You had to have all the different elements of resistance, political, social, cultural, as well as military. And that was what we could use, what we could implement to break the will of the British to remain in this part of Ireland. And you know, an early stage, I would say in the early 70s, we understood that if all you had was a small group of, no matter how well armed, no matter how well trained, no matter how effective, if you had an IRA cell or an IRA commando unit, if that was all the resistance that you had within your area, it could quite easily be dealt with by the British through internment, imprisonment, assassination, and therefore the resistance had to amount to much, much more than simply the point of the spear. So Fergus talked about the community resistance. We've heard about the idea that, you know, you had to have, we actually had to develop our own economy in West Belfast as well. We had to develop our own society, which was outside what the British had here. And I suppose that the biggest problem that we suffered in the later years was the normalization of the emergency situation that we were living in. Because what it's, you know, anybody walking onto the streets of Belfast for the first time in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s, and seeing the British Army going about their work, pointing their rifles into people's faces, dragging people from cars, smashing people's homes. You know, what is going on? How is this happening? And yet, that's what happened every day of the week, and to a large extent, it became normalized. And it was a really sort of a crazy situation if you think of it. But in terms of, you know, what Tommy said, I feel a lot of sympathy with, you know, we aren't here to, or I don't feel that it's my job to tell you guys how to organize your own resistance, how to organize your own struggle. I will tell you, if you want, I will tell you how we countered the actions of the British. But I won't tell you how you got to do it. That's entirely up to you guys. You guys have to figure that out. You guys have to learn from other people, obviously. But it's not our job to tell you what you got to do. So, Kaponasak, Shin Misha, Shin Nest.
Gurmanaga Hina, Bishana Rose or Fad, that's great. I just seen in the chat coming through there a mention of Tommy McKerney's book. Apologies to Tommy, Garag me Shinamak, Tommy's book, The Provisional IRA from Interaction to Parliament, published by Pluto Press in 2011, is worth purchasing for anybody who wants to get a longer description of some of the themes Tommy spoke to there. We're going to now hand back to Callie and Edgit, who are going to take over the moderation from here and perhaps steward the conversation from this point on. So over to yourselves, comrades.
Thanks, Fergal. Just trying to take all of that in. Number one, thank you all for sharing, you know, your experience. Never like trying to ask folks to kind of recount a lot of the trauma that, you know, you experienced. So again, thank you all for sharing, and definitely resonate with the last point, that we are going to have to figure out how to deal ourselves with this. And the point of this, you know, starting this today, this conversation, and others that we want to follow, is just really, you know, for a U.S. audience, particularly I think a younger generation who were not alive, you know, to kind of witness, at least from how it was portrayed anyway, you know, like the hunger strike. I remember watching that, you know, as it was covered on TV from an American perspective, you know, which is filtered through a British perspective. But so trying to kind of draw some of these lessons as the democratic space here shrinks, you know, and as more attacks and provocations, you know, come our way, which we see more and more with how the various forces on the right are trying to hone in, particularly on quote unquote the left, and say that the violence, all of the violence that's being perpetrated in this society now is somehow coming from the left, as if we don't, you know, recall all the horrors visited upon the Black community, not in the distant past, but we can remember the church shooting, that took place during Trump's first administration, and many other things. Again, thank you, for all of that. Hopefully, the audience is listening and putting in context. And I think one of the more important pieces that we really also, I guess, in the follow-up series, want to really get into was after all that. What is the work to organize the peace? Because that is a critical piece that we are going to have to try to figure out to try to avoid major kind of civil disruption and violence in the United States, to make it less acute than it appears that the right is really aiming it to be. And how do you kind of rebuild, have dialogue across differences? Those are some lessons that we also, I think, want to draw up and deal with, but that may be for another time. But I think the piece, I'm looking at some of the questions, and just to say here, very clearly, the point of this was not to highlight the IRA. I know some of you who in the chat were kind of saying that you were going to report this to the FBI as a means to target those on this very program. The point is to learn from how different communities dealt with these types of invasions and incursions and violations of human and civil rights. So, that's a critical piece that we really want to share and highlight, because it's already happening with the disappearances and I could go on. But in the time we have remaining, we were really going to try to keep this to an hour and a half. There were a set of questions, I think, that came up, or maybe some things that from the audience, and also some back and forth with all of you. So, again, if you wanted to highlight a couple of different points so we can break some of this off, is there anything that stuck out to you that you wanted to highlight or ask?
Yes. First of all, just deep appreciation for sharing your experiences. While obviously you can't just take what happened in one place and apply the same strategies to another. I think there's so many similarities because, ultimately it's about colonization and oppression of nationalities, which is usually done, in similar ways. So I really, and it's not just, learning about those things, but it's just so inspiring for us to know that you can experience all of the repression that you have and remain steadfast in your commitment and continue to engage. It means very so much to us, especially right now. So just much gratitude to you all. Some of the questions that have come up are, one is the issue of divisiveness amongst folks in communities and movements that are trying to defend ourselves from this repression. How do we get past the sectarianism or petty differences that kind of keep our communities stuck? So that's one question. And also, I think a couple of speakers spoke about how we can counter the normalization of this, kind of a military presence and fear and violence in our communities. But if there's any more that you can share about ways to keep people, to stop people from getting used to these situations and kind of adapting to them, but continuing to see them as for what they are. So I would highlight those two questions, and then if we have time, there's a few more. and it's not to any one in particular. So,
those are the speakers or anybody who wanted to share.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Fergal.
There you go.
No,
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, you can hear you now.
I was just going to direct, Edgar, I was going to suggest that I would direct that first question to Fergus, if Fergus is still with us here, which was Fergus looking at this idea of division and divisiveness and how in an intensive period of military occupation, sometimes it's hard to stop divisions, and how, because I know Fergus had 30 years experience of movement building, of mass movement building across different organizations and pulling them together and trying to find a cohesive unity of purpose. So perhaps Fergus, you could speak to that one, and then as for the second question, which was looking at how we can counter that narrative that this is normalized, perhaps the others could come in on that, or both. I don't want to be prescriptive on this. Well, that's it. Yes, a gladly argue.
Good, Margaret. Fergal. Yeah, that's a difficult issue, and it comes up time and time again, and it's come up recently. I mean, we're everyone, I suppose, all around the world is organising in support of Gaza against the genocide that's there, and there's divisions and so on that have come up, even up in that scenario. I mean, my way of approaching this is to try and talk to people, obviously, and there are more than, to convince them that there are more than one ways of being right. That if one person can, or one group can argue to try this, or to do this, and another person can argue to do that, and maybe just let them. You know, if so long as it's not going to seriously put the organization back, or put the campaign back, or put the movement back, then okay, well, let's try this route. Let them go and do it, and then find out whether they're right or they're wrong. I remember, totally irrelevant or sort of different, when we started up a school, an Irish language secondary school, and I was sort of in charge of that, and teachers would come. I have my own experiences and my own ways of thinking that things should be done, and someone come up with another suggestion. And the way one of the other teachers would come up and say, I want to do this. And my way of assessing those things, well, if this goes wrong, will it seriously affect the overall project? And if it doesn't, then let's go and see it, and possibly they will learn that they were wrong to move that, or maybe I'll learn that they were right, that there are different ways of doing it. I don't know whether that's explaining things, but if we can get that sort of approach whereby people can have different views of the way forward, and if we in some sort of comradely way discuss this and say, well, okay, what are your views? What are you trying to achieve? And let the organizations go forward on that basis, that, okay, we have a different point of view. At this point of view, it won't necessarily fundamentally destroy the movement. So let people try their different methods and their different approaches, so long as we stay together on the main road, and we come out together, and we move them, organize the masses together, and organize to get people out. I mean, I find, for example, and this is possibly going off the question slightly, at the moment, as I mentioned, there's lots and lots of people coming out here in Belfast and other places throughout Ireland around for Palestine. Inevitably, you have people coming out on marches and marches and marches, and I feel that we need, for example, that when you're in the middle of a movement, that it's important to make sure that you're organizing everyone who can be organized at whatever level they can be organized. So maybe marches are not suitable for people, for particular groups of people or whatever. Well, then what can they be doing in their own area? I mentioned earlier on, coming back from major meetings during the hunger strikes, when we would be planning major demonstrations and major activities, and come back to discover that local groups were doing their own thing. And I think that's very important, that people have the freedom to come up. I mean, I remember coming back from one meeting, and there was a group of people standing, praying for the hunger strikers. Now, I didn't personally think that was going to necessarily change anything. Maybe I was wrong, but that was the way that group wanted to show their support. So let them go and do that. It wasn't doing any harm. It may have been doing good. Who knows? And and so on. We come back and suddenly people were doing white line pickets, doing pickets in the middle, down the middle of the road, not blocking the road, just doing these, having posters and standing in the middle of the road. Cars were going up and down. That idea didn't come from any committee. That idea didn't come from any organizing group. It wasn't argued and discussed. Just some people decided this is a good idea. Let's go and do it. So sometimes a lot of this ideological splitting comes down to a tactical decision here or there. And some people may not think it's the right tactic, but it may not be the wrong tactic. So maybe we should all draw back a little bit and sort of say, well, okay, let's let people see how they write in their own way and producing different approaches and different tactics. I'm not sure whether that's very clear but I think that easing off, we have hard ideological positions and people take up hard ideological positions. And I think we need to try and back off from that in terms of this particular movement, whatever it happens to be, or whatever we're trying to achieve in particular circumstance. Then, provided, as I say, it's not going to fundamentally do damage to the whatever it is we're trying to do, that different approaches can be taken. I don't know whether anyone else wants to come in. On the other, basically on the other thing you were saying about what was it, keeping, I can't even read my own writing here.
The normalization.
Yeah, I find, I'll be very brief on this. I mean, I find I remember when we started off, we're teenagers, we're 16, we're 17, 18, whatever it is. And suddenly the civil rights movement came onto the streets. And I remember reading, for example, the thing that Tommy mentioned there about the Special Powers Act, which was a draconian law which they had here. It only was used every now and again whenever part of the population began to rise up and protest or to do something which sort of the state didn't like. So the rest of us were all living quite unknowing that this draconian piece of legislation was hanging over our heads to be used against us whenever the states saw fit. And I have it upstairs, actually framed, a copy of the Special Powers Act. And I remember sitting down and that been shown to me. For example, that the state can kill someone and they don't have to have an autopsy or give any explanation as to why they did it. These sort of draconian laws. And it was only when we saw that, we suddenly said, well, this has to be changed. So it's keeping people informed. It is looking, getting the message. I think sometimes it's very important how you present the message. And I'm sure we all know this. And I know I'm talking to people who will know exactly how to go about this. But to make the argument irrefutable, to develop your arguments so that they're clear and that they're absolutely, people can't come back and say, well, what about this? What about that? I remember I'll be very brief about this. I remember Tony Benn, who was a member of the British Parliament, he's the father of the Secretary of State that we have now, who's nothing like his father, who's nothing in the same category. But I remember him being on a radio program and being asked about the sort of society he wanted, the socialism that he wanted. Do you want this Cuban model? Do you want a Chinese model? Do you want a Russian model? And he said very simply, when I go into a school and I see, or I go into a hospital and I see people being treated on the basis of their need, not on the basis of how much money their parents have, that's the sort of society I want to build. Or when I go to a school and I see children being educated on the basis of their ability, not on the basis of what how much their parents can afford. So no one, and the interviewer who was trying to knock him back, he couldn't argue, though. He couldn't argue against that. And I think we need to take that approach. Whatever the issues are, to hone the arguments and put them across and keep them in front of people. Keep talking, keep giving out leaflets, keep going on Facebook, set up radios, go on the radio stations and get the message out. And it's a continuous operation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Does anybody else want to come in on that?
Yeah, can I just come in a wee minute? Just briefly, during our troubles, we kept everything very normal. We kept everything as normal as possible. Schools continued, everybody still went to school, everybody were still made to do their homework, everybody still played their sports, everybody still went if they could in the local area, went to dances, singing. You see everything that's normal that you do normally, do that normally. And as my father always said, multiply and educate, and that's the way forward. Okay, I think that's it.
Fergal, just a comment. Take that make sense?
Yep, go ahead. Yep.
Okay, it was simply to emphasize the stuff that Fergus had mentioned earlier, where he talked about information and explanation being crucial to everything that you're doing, that people have to know. If you're asking people to do something, there has to be a good reason behind it. They have to have a good understanding of why they're doing it. And information about what the nature of your campaign, whatever your campaign happens to be, an agreement around it, like and if somebody else can talk about the way that we were able to pull the 5 demands together, because whenever we talked about we want political status, well, people are saying, what does that even mean, political status? So we were able to break it down into understandable objectives, which we could put to people and get the agreement of people on in a very straightforward and collective way.
Cut Boots, Tommy, do you want to come in on that?
Just briefly to reinforce what the 2 or 3 previous speakers have said. I think we're talking here about political education, to be exact. I think it's very important to figure out why what's happening is going on, particularly in your country and the States. It's no accident. It's not just an irrational old bowsy of a president. There is a cynical plan behind what they're at to keep the people divided, particularly the working class divided. There's no accident. There's a reason for it, and that's to keep control. I think so long as you're clear about the political education and what's happening and why it's happening and how it's happening, then I think it's going to prevent the establishment reducing the entire thing to normality.
Yeah. Can I come back just for a second on that to reinforce that point? Can people hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Fergus.
It's just that idea of making the message absolutely clear. I remember now, way early on the start of the Troubles, I was a teacher, and I was at a teachers' conference way down in the south of Ireland in Kerry, as far as you can get from the north of Ireland here. And I was at this conference, and we were all in the bar afterwards, and I was singing a song to get back to the importance of singing. And I sang a song about the Hits blocks and what was going on up here during the hunger strikes. And a number of teachers came up to me after I'd sung the song and said, "Tell us this. Is what's happening up there, does that song tell us the truth of what's happening up there, or is the media that we're hearing down here that it's the IRA is the problem? That's what the issue is. There's no question of British oppression or anything, and that's what those people were being taught and told time and time again by the media. Now, if you're living at the other side of Ireland and you're not sure, you want to come up to a demonstration to support people, but you're not sure because the media is telling you lies, you won't move. In order for us to get people to move, we have to convince them. The opposition only have to sold out. They just sold out and say, but you don't know this side, you don't know that side. So that's why it's so important that we get our message across irrefutable. You make the arguments so that they're totally clear and that people, and they can't be knocked back. And that's our job, because as I said, the opposition, the government just has to throw out mud and say, it's more complex, it's all very complicated, because people will not travel, people will not get themselves involved if there's an issue of doubt. If they're anyway in doubt, why would they come out onto the streets and endanger themselves? It's only when they're convinced that the cause is right and that they need to do something about it that you'll get them out. So the whole issue of getting the message out, when we were young, during that period, there was a statement which said, I think it was Chairman Mao or someone said, all power comes from the barrel of a gun. And that's how a lot of people were organized. In the 70s, you had military struggles all over the world, Nicaragua, South Africa, and so on. And that was a very popular consensus. I think what I have learned over the years is what's more powerful than a gun is a person's mind, if you can convince them of the rightness of a cause, then that's more powerful. And I think the biggest demonstration of it up here, and I don't know whether people, was that during the hunger strikes, you had Bobby Sands in prison, surrounded by all the might of the British Army. Screws in the prisons, prison officers, whatever you want to call them, police, barbed wire, and the British Army all around him, and they could not break his mind. So that's the sort of, that it is absolutely imperative that we get our arguments clear and we put them across strongly. And that's the most strong and the most powerful weapon that we have in our hands.
Fergus, that's fantastic. I'm sure we all are in agreement with what you have said there. I'm going to hand over to Edgar, Joe, and Callie. But before I do, just from our end, I know we're pushed for time. It's a shame. If we had more time, we would ask Fergus to get his guitar out and sing a few of them songs. He's actually a brilliant folk singer. So maybe that's something we can think about again. We can have an online folk concert, revolutionary folk concert. But from our end, one of the things that Joe mentioned earlier on, our ongoing collaboration with the PNLL, Collaboration Jackson, and others. Fergus and people like him put a huge stack in international solidarity when our people were in that very, very oppressive and harrowing time. And Fergus travelled the United States, met with activists and lobbies. So from our end, we want to commit to do that. We have a lot of political education projects coming up throughout the year, community festivals, winter education schools, and we would like the issue of what's happening in the States to be front and center, that we can share with others. And we think that's one of the acts of solidarity that we can bring to the table from our end. So I'll hand you over to Edgar, Joe, and Callie in whatever order you want to take it.
Thanks, Fergal. Tandy, if there's a way that you can get us all back on the screen just for us to do a closeout. But while that is happening and trying to pull us up, we want to thank everybody who spoke. We want to thank Lord Mona and Trademark, for sharing this history, for providing context, providing some of the lessons on how you all dealt with the British occupation of the 6 counties. And it's up to us to kind of draw some of the lessons, and impart this and do the broad level of organizing in our community in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead towards, combating this ultra-reactionary movement and building a new world. I mean, that's the task that's ahead of us. And, just want to remind, the audience that this is the beginning of a series of exchanges that we really want to do, with comrades all over the world who have fought, fascist regimes, right-wing authoritarian dictatorships, really oppressive monarchies. We're going to run a gamut, hopefully, in the time and space we have available to try to just educate ourselves and inspire and build solidarity. That is fundamentally what we're aiming to do with this particular series, and this was just to start. So, Joe or Egate, anything else you guys want to add before we close on out?
No, just thank you all so very much, and let's stay in touch, continue to build.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gloria Mona, Trademark, all the panelists, all the people watching. It's humbling and also empowering to hear such powerful testimonials from a period of struggle in a different context, in a different time, but one which has, I think, some powerful lessons and takeaways for us today. With me, I'm sitting with the thought about the importance of building that autonomous solidarity economy that allows us to provision ourselves no matter what's happening. The powerful statements about education and about the importance of bringing people together around the ideas that we're going to need to stitch this thing back together at the other end, because that's the most powerful thing. It's overall, really, which is that even though we're trembling on the brink of something dark and dangerous in America at the moment, it's important to remember that this too shall pass, and that we need to all be preparing for how we construct the peace and the democracy that we need to rebuild after these difficulties. So thank you all, and we will be in touch about further events in this series. But go well, go in peace, and be well. Thank you.
Thank you. Solidarity forever.
That's right.
Okay.
Thanks. Go MAGA.
Uh,
Thank you.